Once upon a time in England, a boy was born in February 12, 1809. He was the fifth of 6 children. While he was little, he was curious about how stuff was made. All the questions he used to make in his head while he took a walk alone in the forest, building stuff and wondering how they were made, led to an amazing naturalist explorer. He attended at Cambridge, where he studied natural theology. When he came back home, he received a letter from Henslow, who invited him to an expedition which lasted 2 years, on a boat named the Beagle. On their expedition, they noticed that the birds on the Galapagos Island were different from the ones of different places, and the pics of the birds vary among the different parts of the same island. But at the end, it was the same type of bird. After considerable explorations in South America, the Beagle reached the Galapagos Islands in September 1835. Darwin was fascinated by such oddities as volcanic rocks and giant tortoises. He later wrote about approaching tortoises, which will retreat into their shells. The young scientist will then climb on top and attempt to ride the large reptile when it began moving again. He recalled that it was difficult to keep his balance. While in the Galapagos, Darwin collected samples of mockingbirds and later observed that the birds were somewhat different on each island. This made him think that the birds had a common ancestor, but had followed varying evolutionary paths once they were separated. The Beagle left the Galapagos and arrived at Tahiti in November 1835, and then sailed onward to reach New Zealand in late December. In January 1836, the Beagle arrived in Australia, where Darwin was favorably impressed by the young city of Sydney. After exploring coral reefs, the Beagle continued on its way, reaching the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa at the end of May 1836. Sailing back into the Atlantic Ocean, the Beagle in July reached St. Helena, the remote island where Napoleon Bonaparte had died in exile. The Beagle also reached a British outpost on Ascension Island in the South Atlantic, where Darwin received some very welcome letters from his sister in England. The Beagle then sailed back to the coast of South America before returning to England, arriving at Falmouth on October 2, 1836. The entire voyage had taken nearly 5 years.
Meanwhile, in January 8 of 1823, on another part of England, a new naturalist explorer was born. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. He was not the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, but the seventh of 9 children. He attended law school, and after several years of harsh studies, he finally graduated. As the years passed, he began to travel around the world. He passed 10 years of his life making 70 trips. On one of his expeditions to the Amazon River, he was with the naturalist Henry Walter Bates, where they observed different species of plants and animals. These observations led Wallace to develop a theory about how species of plants and animals gradually change through a process known as evolution or natural selection. Thus, Darwin on his side was making his own theory. Excerpts from the manuscripts of both scientists were issued in a joint publication in July 1858. From 1854 to 1862, he contacted his fellow researchers in the islands of Malaysia. During his later expedition, he noted fundamental zoological differences between the animal species of Asia and those of Australia. After observing this, he placed a zoological dividing line that nowadays is known as Wallace Line between the Malayan island of Borneo and Celebes. In the second half of the 19th century, there were many scientific expeditions into Amazonian to study the wide range of exotic plants and animals which live there, and even to study the people. Scientific explorers as Wallace often gave exciting accounts of their exploits, with their letters and journals sometimes being serialized in newspapers and magazines. These were then illustrated with drawings showing pictures of the explorer travelers, strange new plants and animals, and Indian villages. It is through these journals that we now have our only records of what some Indian cultures were like when they first made contact with civilization. When both expeditions were finished, Wallace and Darwin began to review their work.
When both expeditions were finished, Wallace and Darwin began to review their work. Darwin began formulating his theory of natural selection in the late 1830s, but he went on working quietly on it for 20 years. He wanted to amass a wealth of evidence before publicly presenting his new idea. During those years, he corresponded briefly with Wallace, who was exploring the wildlife of South America and Asia. Wallace supplied Darwin with birds for his studies and decided to seek Darwin's help in publishing his own ideas on evolution. He sent Darwin his theory in 1858, which, to Darwin's shock, nearly replicated Darwin's own. Months later, Charles Lyell A. and Joseph Dalton Hooker B. arranged for both Darwin's and Wallace's theories to be presented to a meeting of the Linnean Society in 1858. Darwin had been working on a Meyer book of evolution, and used that to develop on the origins of a species, which was published in 1859. The book was not only a bestseller, but also one of the most influential scientific books of all time. Yet it took time for its full argument to take hold. Within a few decades, most scientists accepted that evolution and the descent of species from common ancestors was real, but natural selection had a harder time finding acceptance. Wallace, on the other hand, continued his travels from focus his study on the importance of biogeography. He even published various books. Darwin died on April 8, 1982, and Wallace died on November 7th, 1913.
Tres.
Well, today we're going to talk about both Charles and Wallace of their different thinkings about evolution. Well, at first, Charles said that the abilities were passed by individuals and not by groups. That means if a bird has a larger beak, not all the species is going to have a larger beak. And Wallace said the opposite, that all the species was going to have the same trait. For example, the birds, they were all going to have the larger beak, but that's not true. Charles said that the animals that had the ability used it as an advantage for getting food or surviving or finding shelter, etc. So that would mean competence. Like the animal would use the advantage, and then the offspring would have the same advantage. And in Wallace, he said that the animal got the advantage because of the environment, because he needed to have the advantage, so it survived the environment. Thoroughly, Wallace was untrue. It was proved that he was incorrect, but he contributed because both of these people shared ideas with each other. But two of them the ideas. The similarities. Well, both thought the animals adapted to environments. Both supported natural selection. That would mean if an animal had the larger beak, it would survive because the other ones wouldn't. So that species would cross with another bird, and that trait would pass on. So they would have larger chance of survival. Well, yes, and basically every trait that was developed, it was going to pass off to all offspring. So the little birds were going to have larger beaks, thus they will have easier advantage from prey or seeds.